Hi there guys, Mr. Martin here again. Thanks so much for joining me. Now in this video, this is going to be the second of our two videos into non-experimental methods. And in this one we're going to be looking at observation and case studies. Now if you haven't seen my previous video that we did first on interviews and surveys, I recommend you go back and watch that first. There's a few different concepts there that dovetail into this one. But let's assume that you've already seen that one, so let's dive straight into looking at observation and case studies. Quick reminder, let's say for whatever reason we have chosen not to do an experiment. Perhaps it's impractical to do an experiment, unethical perhaps, or it might just be flat out impossible. So therefore we've chosen to do a non-experimental method. In the previous video we looked at surveys where we give questions to our participants and ask them to fill them in, or we might have interviewed them and give them those questions face to face. But there's the two other types of method here that we're going to look at today. We're going to look at observation first, and then we'll look at case study. Observation, the clue is kind of in the name for this one. Observation is a major research method where all we do is sit back and watch. We will watch what's going on as it happens around us, and we'll record what we see. Now, it's a really important distinction to make here. This is not an experiment. We don't change anything in the environment around us. We might have put a few things there, but we're not really changing anything in those participants' lives. We just watch them as they get on with it. So therefore, we're not really interested in the effect of X on Y. We're just interested in the holistic picture, what's actually happening in our participants' lives. There's lots of different types of observation. We're going to have a look at a few of them in this episode. There are quite a lot of other ones as well, but those are a bit more advanced and for more advanced psychologists. But the ones that we'll have a look at are naturalistic observation, controlled observation, and a kind of funky last one that's called participant observation, which we'll look at in a few moments' time. Well, let's look at naturalistic observation first. Naturalistic observation, it's the simplest and most easy type of observation. All we do is watch. We don't tend to tell the participants what we're doing, so we tend to sit back in public. We might be sitting on a park bench, or we might be following someone around in a Tesco's or a Sainsbury's or something. There's no expectation of privacy when you're in public, so that's okay, and we're watching what's going on, just naturally, whatever happens in an everyday setting. Now that's really interesting, because if you compare that to every other method, including the experimental methods that we've looked at already, then this is the most honest method that we have. We are watching humans as they are behaving normally. Now that, for psychologists, is the ultimate end goal, remember. We're really interested in what do humans do. So a naturalistic observation where we're hanging back and watching is realistically the only method that gathers honest, true-to-life human behaviour. But that also leads into a negative issue, because there's a lack of control in this thing. All we can say is the human is behaving that way. But we don't know why they're behaving that way. We don't know what it is or what's happening in their lives that's made them behave that way. So it's really a very shallow type of observation that we're doing. As well as that, you are never ever going to be able to replicate this, or if you are, it's going to be incredibly difficult. Everything about a person's day will influence their behaviour. The weather that day, the route that they took to work, how many people were on the bus. They might be feeling a little bit unwell. Maybe they're hungover. There's lots and lots of different things that could impact their behaviour, and therefore we are never going to get those same situations, scenarios in our lives again. Therefore very difficult to replicate. That's why it's the simplest form. It's also kind of the weakest form as well. Another type of observation is something called controlled observation. This is sometimes known as structured observation, and you'll see why. This is kind of the alternative to naturalistic observation. What we do here is we bring the participants to us. We place them into a lab, and then we watch them what's happening in their lives. Now, people do get confused with this and say, well, why isn't that an experiment if we have them in the lab? But remember, a lab in psychology is just any area that we have made for a specific purpose. It doesn't need to have bubbling test tubes and Bunsen burners. All it needs to have is a controlled environment. But again, we don't really change anything about it. We just simply watch what's happening. So in this picture here, you can see we've given the participants a task to do, and the psychologist is watching what's going on. This is sometimes done from behind a one-way mirror, like you've probably seen in cop shows or cop movies, those kind of things. But sometimes it's just done through a window. Either way, it's still controlled observation. Why might we do a controlled observation? Well, there's more control. The kind of clues in the name of this one. There's more control than naturalistic observation. If we want it to be warm in the lab, then we make it warm in the lab. If we want it to be cold, we make it cold. If we want our participants with no hangover, then we make sure that they don't have a hangover. There's much more control. Again, not an experiment. We don't change anything about their scenario, but we have a bit more control over who is in front of us and what's happening. Negative side to that, however, though, is that this lacks ecological validity, same as lab experiments do. So what if our participants behave one way inside our laboratory? Are they going to behave that way normally, naturally? We simply don't know, and therefore controlled observation does not really give us honest, true-to-life human behaviour. Still interesting, though. There is a last type of observation that's a little bit more weird and kind of funky. It's called participant observation. This is where a researcher is interested in watching what's going on, but in this case, they actually take part in their participants' lives. They become part of their situation. Now, you can either do this overtly, so you tell the people, I'm such and such a psychologist from this university, I'm really interested in hanging out with you and watching what's going on. Or you can do it covertly, which is where you go in, you don't tell anyone who you are, you're almost like an undercover cop, and then you watch what's going on. Rosenhan's 1973 study, a really, really good example of this. He sent his researchers into insane asylums in America, and he asked them to watch what was going on around them. Really, really interesting study, and you can see that they'd taken part in their participants' lives. Why would we do participant observation? It is a unique method. It gives us a perfect insight into social situations. As well as that, it sometimes gives us insight into places that psychologists wouldn't normally be able to go. Places like insane asylums or hospitals, places that's a little bit more undercover, which is also a really, really interesting avenue for us to explore. The downside of participant observation, there's two of these. Is it subjective? All we've really got going on here is the participants doing a particular behaviour, and the psychologist writes that down. Well, is that because the psychologist is there already? Is that why they're doing that behaviour? If we were to take the psychologist out of that situation, would the participants behave the same way? We don't really know, so it might be subjective. As well as that, there are huge ethical issues here. How would you feel if one of your friends suddenly turned around and said, oh, by the way, actually, I've been a psychologist all this time and I've actually been writing down everything that you've been doing and saying? Would you feel happy with that? Would that be an intrusion of your privacy and your confidentiality? Probably would do. So you can see that there are ethical issues with this as well. The last thing we'll talk about in terms of observation is this issue of disclosure, to tell or not to tell. A psychologist has two options. Either they tell their participants that they're being watched, that they're part of an observation, or you don't tell them. Those are your two options. Now, there are pros and cons to doing both of these. If you do disclose to your participants that they're being watched, then you get out of any ethical issues that you could potentially have come across. The participants know they're being watched, so they are responsible for their own behaviour. However, if you do disclose observation to people, it can lead to something called the Hawthorne effect. You take a look at this graphic here, it tells you all you need to know about the Hawthorne effect. This effect simply says, when people know that they're being watched, their behaviour will change. It's part of human nature. People will change their behaviour if they know they are being watched. So that leads us to the question then, if we have told our participants that they're being watched, is the behaviour that they then do true? Is that their actual behaviour? Or is it simply the behaviour that they have when they're being watched? We don't know, so we have to be careful. The other option would be not to disclose that they are watching our participants. And you can see we get around the Hawthorne effect if we do it that way. More natural data, for sure. The participants more likely to give true behaviour. But unethical again. You don't really like to be watched by people if you don't know that you're being watched. That's kind of creepy, a little bit weird, a little bit sinister. So again, you have to be really careful with not disclosing about an observation. The last thing we'll talk about here is a case study. Now, a case study is the last form of non-experimental method that we'll talk about. Also the most powerful method, but still very, very difficult to do. A case study is an in-depth analysis, usually based on one individual, someone of real interest to the psychological fraternity, but it might be conducted on a small group of people. It might be a family or a team, maybe a small group of children, something like that. Case studies classically used by people like Freud, for example, to build up his theories, one person in a huge amount of depth. Case studies tend to be longitudinal. If you've never heard of that word before, just have a look at the way it breaks down. It's long, and what that means is it's done over a long amount of time. Normal psychology study, typically one day, maybe a couple of days if you invite your participants back. Longitudinal studies, typically years. You follow people as they grow up through their lives. That's a longitudinal study. We're interested in that in the case study. Gives us rich, detailed information, some absolutely incredible stuff that we can have a look at. I'll give you an example here. Two psychologists, they were called Thigpen and Cleckley, this is way back in 1954, presented a really famous case of something that we call dissociative identity disorder. You guys might be more familiar with that as something called multiple personality disorder, but we prefer the DID, dissociative identity disorder. Now, in their interviews with a female patient, it actually became apparent that when they were doing this case study, that she had more than one person inside of her. That's absolutely bizarre and weird, but really cool. One of these people, these personalities inside of her, called herself Eve White. She was a bit, let's say, uptight. She was law-abiding, a little bit kind of, you know, that kind of person. Whereas another one introduced herself as Eve Black. She was more flirtatious. She was a bit shallow. She really liked to kind of flaunt herself and be sexy. Completely different personalities. There was actually a third, more reasonable personality that emerged as they were going through this case study. This whole thing was made into a film. You can see it here, The Three Faces of Eve. That's actually based on a true story. It won an Oscar for Best Actress way back in 1957, I think it was. Really worth a watch if you fancy it. Really interesting part of history. Case studies, generally we use them for unique people, people that have bizarre disorders, things that have never been seen before, perhaps only one or two people have ever had them. Or we might use them for atypical people as well, people that are on the fringes of society, people that we're really interested in. We don't tend to use case studies for your regular run-of-the-mill people. We tend to reserve that for the unique people like Eve Black, Eve White on the right-hand side here. What are the benefits of using case studies? There's a couple. It allows the researcher to focus exclusively on specific instances of behaviour. And doing it that way allows us to identify processes, variables, things which are happening in the participant's life, and give us more of an idea about cause and effect. Why are they behaving that way? What is it about this person that makes them like that? It gives us a rich, incredibly rich source of meaningful data. This is qualitative data, really, really interesting stuff about people in particular. However, downsides of this are that any results that we have are specific to that individual. So what are we learning? So what that one person behaves that way with this incredibly rare mental condition? But what does that tell us about human beings as a whole? Doesn't really tell us much, right? So there's not really a good reason to generalize specific to the individual. So what have we learned? We can't replicate that. As well as that, it's time consuming and expensive, especially if we're doing a longitudinal study. If we're following someone over, let's say 5, 10, 20 years, it's going to cost a huge amount of money to do that and be very time consuming as well. And the last thing is unique to this method is that there is potential interference between the researcher and the participant. The girl that you can see on the right-hand side here, her name is Jeannie. She was a horrendously abused individual, really, really nastily abused by her father. Couldn't really walk, couldn't really speak when she was discovered. A really horrendous case. Her psychologist, the person that was interested in her, was, I can't remember the name offhand but just now, but really, really interesting case. However, Was there a conflict of interest there? We want to learn more about the effect of Jeannie's abuse and the effect it had on her psychological health. But do we also have to try and treat her, make her better? Is there a conflict of interest between what the psychologist wants to know and what her heart tells her? It's a bit of a difficult one there, but that's potential interference and doesn't really tell us a lot about the person themselves. Again, you have to be so careful with a case study. Key concepts here, guys. We've looked at 3 different types of observation: naturalistic, controlled, and participant observation. We've also looked at this idea of disclosure as well. Do you tell your participants they're being watched or do you not? That's up to you. And we've also looked very, very briefly at case studies as well. If you can get these ideas into your heads, then you're doing really, really well so far. That's all for this video, guys. Thanks so much for listening to me. I hope your revision is going great, and we'll see you again in the next video when we're going to talk about ethics. Until then, take it easy, and we'll see you next time. Cheers!